Dr. Norman Finkelstein, on behalf of the Middle East Discussion Group here at the Josef Korbel School, I'd like to thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real privilege to have you here today in light of the news out of Palestine, the unification of the governments in the West Bank and Hamas. Haniyeh and Abbas have finally made peace on the back end of what really was a failed peace process brokered by John Kerry. What is the future of this process as the United States and Israel say, we can't deal with them as a unified group?
I think it's impossible to predict, and it's unclear exactly what the significance of it is. My own impression is that the Palestinian Authority is basically flailing because it doesn't really know what to do. So one week it announces it's going to go to the United Nations and it's going to join all of these UN divisions and hints at joining the ICC. Another day it talks about dissolving the Palestinian Authority. A third day it talks about unity with Hamas. There's no vision, there's no strategy, there's basically flailing. We don't quite know what to do. So I don't think it makes much sense to speculate right now on the prospects. First of all, whether it will actually materialize. Second of all, whether the steps that have been adumbrated, the national unity government, the elections in 6 months, and so forth, whether they will actually materialize. And then how long it will hold together. And then the bottom line is what will be its political ramifications. Those are all question marks. I frankly am a skeptic. There's a huge amount written this morning on it, which I've not read yet. But I'm frankly a skeptic among basic issues. Will they really integrate their armed forces? I find that hard to believe.
Yeah. Is it a failure of, I mean, Abbas thinks that this is a turning point for the Palestinian side, but a month ago you hear from Israel that you can't negotiate with a divided Palestine, and now you have a united Palestine, and they say we can't negotiate with a united Palestine because Hamas is there and they're a terrorist organization. Aaron David Miller saying the same thing on behalf of the United States. Is it a failure of having a honorable partner on the other side of the table, or is this, I mean, who needs to make a change in order to have progress here?
Well, most of the commentators are flaming imbeciles, of which Aaron David Miller is, I would say, paradigmatic. He's a complete moron and embarrassment to whatever institution he's currently attached. There are smart people in the Kerry State Department. Robert Malley is a very smart guy. He used to be with the Crisis Group. Now he's with heading up the National Security Agency, I think it's called. He's a smart guy. The current position of the U.S. is obviously going to be the same one as they had before, which is that Hamas has to accept the 3 conditions of recognizing Israel, honoring past agreements, and renouncing violence. And Hamas will never accept those conditions because Israel has never accepted any of those 3 conditions. Israel doesn't recognize Palestine, at least as it's understood in international law, namely the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem are occupied Palestinian territories designated for Palestinian self-determination. That was the determination of the International Court of Justice in July 2004 in their advisory opinion. So Israel doesn't recognize Palestine. Israel doesn't recognize past agreements. It de facto, with all the stipulations it put into Bush's roadmap, everybody agrees that it effectively repudiated the roadmap, which is one of the key past agreements which is always brought up. And the idea of Israel renouncing violence is just a kind of an oxymoron. So why Hamas would accept these conditions when Israel itself hasn't accepted them? And that will be the U.S. precondition. The position of the way the PA is going to try to get around it is to say, well, look at the crazy people in Netanyahu's coalition, and nobody has asked them, nobody has forced on them to accept the three conditions. Whether that will fly or not, it's hard to say. But the conflict could have been resolved already before you were born. The international consensus began to form in the mid-1970s for resolving the conflict, which is a two-state settlement in the June 1967 border with some sort of resolution of the refugee question. The only obstacle has been Israel backed by the United States. It's perfectly obvious if you look at the annual resolutions at the United Nations, the peaceful settlement of the Palestine question. The vote this past year was 165 countries endorsing it, 6 countries rejecting it. The 6 countries were the United States, Israel, Nauru, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Australia.
Distinguished list there.
That was it. So it's perfectly clear what's blocking a settlement. All you have to do is look at the roll call every year at the United Nations General Assembly.
You talked about the international consensus clearly against the U.S. and Israeli position. Do you think, in terms of solidarity with Palestinians going forward, does the BDS movement have a chance to shape that solidarity going forward, to maybe change public opinion in the United States?
Well, I think there is a question, first of all, of proportions. The BDS movement likes to invoke the anti-apartheid sanctions campaign against South Africa as being its obvious precursor. The analogy falls apart on several grounds, but on the point that's most pertinent right now, everybody agrees that the solidarity, the anti-apartheid sanctions campaign, as noble as it was a secondary factor. The primary factor was, of course, the mass internal movement led by the African National Congress for most of the period. In the 1980s, the United Democratic Front, the UDF, of which the ANC, of course, was a primary factor. In the absence of an internal movement, none of these solidarity campaign can have any kind of effect.
Yeah.
I mean, they can have some effect. They can have some effect. But the idea that BDS can liberate Palestine is just, to my mind, it's kind of it's divorced from reality. And the way BDS now carries on, it carries on as if it can achieve what it calls its 3-point program in the absence of a mass movement in Palestine, which just doesn't really make any sense to me. The whole idea that BDS calls itself the largest civil society movement in Palestine, it also doesn't make any sense to me. Because if it really was, which I don't believe it is, but if it really were a mass movement in Palestine, then why aren't they working on trying to organize internal resistance? Right. Why would they be focusing on an external campaign? It's as if the ANC had invested 90% of its energies in the anti-apartheid sanctions campaign. That doesn't really make any sense. And the problem is that the BDS makes all sorts of claims which have precious little connection with reality. And because it functions, in my opinion, like a cult, people don't, what they always ought to do, they ought to question. De omnibus dubitandum, that was Karl Marx's credo, to doubt everything. The problem with the BDS is you're not allowed to doubt, and if you do doubt, you suffer the fate of Leon Trotsky, short of the ice pick. You become an enemy of the people and agent of the fascists, though critics of BDS are called liberal Zionists, not quite as vitriolic as being accused of being an agent the fascists, but that's how it functions. As to the broader question, of course BDS can play a big role. Boycotts, divestment, sanctions, that's an
as a
important
strategy rather
it's
than
not
as
a,
a,
no,
as
not
an
as
organization.
a, I don't want to be technical about it, but as a tactic.
Yeah.
BDS as a strategy is a complete dead end because it's completely hypocritical. BDS, if you read any of their publications, any of their statements, they always begin by saying that they are anchored in international law. That's their first statement. In fact, BDS issued its so-called call in July 2005 to coincide with the one-year anniversary of the 2004 International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legality of the wall. So they very clearly anchor themselves, both in their program and also as a historical document, in the trajectory of international law or in the context of international law. And so they say that under international law, which is correct, Palestinians have the right to self-determination. And then they proceed to their three-point program, namely Israel's ending of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, implementation of the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, and full equality of Palestinians in Israel, which is all well and good. You can't really argue with those points because that's the law. But Israel is a state, that's also the law. It's the very same law, the very same documents that they cite, the UN General Assembly resolution, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, they are very explicit, very clear, very unambiguous that Israel is a state. And when you put that question to BDS, they say, well, we take no position on Israel. Well, okay, if you take no position on Israel, then Israel doesn't have to take a position on you. That doesn't make any sense. The law consists of, for every right there's an obligation. That's the nature of the law. For every right there's a responsibility. You can't just assert your rights and deny the rights of others under the law. It's as if to say, I have the right to walk at the green, but I'm agnostic on the red. No, you have a right to walk at the green because you have to stop at the red. It's a package deal. And if Palestinians have a right to self-determination and statehood, it's under the same principles of international law which recognize the Israeli right to self-determination and statehood. Now you have two options, you have two choices. One is you can say to hell with the law, which is okay. Nobody's obliged to accept, as an individual, nobody is obliged to accept the legitimacy of the law. You could say, to hell with the law. I don't agree with the law. You could say, as people like to say, the law is made by ruling classes and it's just designed to legitimize the oppression of those who don't have power and so on, of the powerless. Fine, you could say that. But what you can say is, our program is anchored in international law. Our principles are on the basis of international law. And then say, we have no position on Israel. That doesn't make any sense. Now, the odd thing, not the odd thing, the revealing thing is, I've been saying this now for several years. You will never find a response to it. And that's what a cult is. A cult speaks to its followers. And the followers don't question, they just nod their head. And so, nobody answers the most obvious questions because the cult followers don't want to address it.
So BDS as an organization is it a one-state solution organization? Is that the concern?
They say they take no position. And I'll honor that statement, even though if you talk to BDS people individually, on the whole, they say they support one state.
Sure. All right. Well, Dr. Finkelstein, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.